there! Welcome to the A Jesus Church podcast. You're listening to a teaching from our Sunday gathering. We exist to join God in the renewal of all things by becoming a unified, spirit-filled family that follows the way of Jesus. And our desire is to come alongside you to encourage and equip you for that journey. So if we can serve you in any way, please reach out to us through our website at jesuschurch.org/connect. As always, we hope that this teaching increases your hope and deepens your faith.
We're starting off with Genesis 37, verse 1. Genesis 37. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that his father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. We'll flip to Luke 7, verse 36. Verse 36. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went out to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, and she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair and kissed them and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thanks, Trevor. Well, before we sit down, let's pray. Jesus, thank you that we have this time set aside to come, to make space, to meet with you, to hear what you have to say to us. Like ever since you began the church 2,000 years ago, when your people have gathered, our expectation of encountering you and hearing you has been raised. And so would you do that today? Would you tune us into your heart and your voice? Or would you clear away distractions? And if there's something you want to show us, help us to see it and grab a hold of it. Amen. Okay, well, grab a seat. Good morning, everybody. My name's Richard. I'm one of the pastors here. If we've never said hi and I don't know your name, which, by the way, takes about 10 conversations before I remember, so that's pretty much everyone, come say hi at the doors on the way out. And it's an exciting Sunday. This is our last Sunday in Genesis. Yeah. See, I told you we'd speed up. Look at that. Genesis done already. And it's an exciting sporting day. I don't know if you've noticed. We got the Winter Olympics going on. Six Nations rugby has kicked off. The World Cup cricket. Like, did anyone notice the USA nearly beat India? And I hear you got some sort of like local sporting event today going on as well, which actually sort of makes me laugh, watching like Kelton and Chandler in opposing jerseys, and in a world filled with horrible division. I just think, like this is how it should be. So a beautiful picture. So good job. Well, I mean, the day's not done. They may fight later, but so far, good job, Kelton and Chandler. And so last week in Genesis, we left Jacob reuniting with his estranged brother Esau. And he was on his way back to the land that God had promised to settle this new family that God's building in. And we looked at this moment where Jacob and God wrestle. And Jacob's heart is changed from this kind of fight for survival posture, where he's using his power to control everything, to clinging to God for safety, trusting him. And beautiful moment. But this beautiful moment is surrounded by trouble. So Jacob is returning from 20 years with his uncle Laban. 20 years spent with each of them, seeing who can outdo the other in the gentle art of manipulation and trickery. And he returns in this dysfunctional marriage situation with one favorite wife and one spurned wife, both of whom are suffering. And along the journey, one of his daughters, Dinah, gets raped, which is horrible. And then his sons use deceit to massacre an entire clan. And so we see that God's people are in a world mired in brokenness. And they're not exempt from it, but they're entangled in it. And that brings us to chapter 37. Jacob's family unfolding. So we had Abraham, key son Isaac, key son Jacob, and now Jacob's sons. And this is the sort of unfolding of God's promise to build this giant new family. But as it unfolds, there's more dysfunction, more favoritism, rejection, and violence erupting. And I don't know if you've noticed, if you've been reading along in the reading plan with us, these are not isolated incidents. Like, the book of Genesis is full of some pretty awful things. Abraham lies, denying his marriage because he's afraid of violence. Sarah compromises their marriage, leading to jealousy and mistreatment, and eventually Hagar and Ishmael being cast out. Lot, that Tim mentioned a little while ago, ends up in moral chaos in Sodom, offering his daughters to a mob to be raped, thinking that's a solution. Isaac and Rebekah are divided, manipulating and tricking each other because they each have a different favorite son. In some ways, it's no surprise to find Jacob's family full of fractured relationships and lies and violence. And this last section of Genesis is quite a large chunk of chapters that covers the story of Joseph. It is showing us how God's promise is continuing to unfold. It takes us from the promise to Abraham that God would create a new people called by his name, who he could bless to be a blessing as part of God's plan of restoration. And it brings us to then a large clan moving into Egypt, where that clan becomes a great nation. So God is doing what he said he would do. He's multiplying the family, shaping them, establishing them, just like he said he would. But they become an enslaved people, seemingly alienated from the promised plan. Like, it does not look like the plan is going well. But we'll pick that up next week. That's Tim's job. And so more surprises to come. I love setting up the next teacher with the giant, well, what on earth's going on here? So that's into Exodus next week. But also this last section of Genesis, it frames a question that has been brewing all the way through, and it gives us a really poignant answer. And the question is, with broken humans, is there any hope for God's plan to work? Like, God's promised, and you're watching, and you just keep chapter after chapter wanting to, tear your hair out if you've got any, just thinking, how can a people that are going to reveal God to the world and bring God's renewal possibly emerge from so much brokenness? And as sin and evil keep on disrupting, is the plan going to work? It's really easy to sort of have our hopes lifted in Genesis 12 and get to Genesis at the end and just think, hey, do you know what? I don't have much hope left. And Genesis is confronting this tension in stark technicolor. Like, it's really trying to lay the brokenness out as a contrast to the promise, because we are going to keep encountering this question. It's one of life's really big questions. And we're going to keep encountering it through the rest of the scriptures. Israel's history is littered with idolatry and violence and oppression as Israel's leaders keep choosing the way of Babel, the way of the serpent, over the way back to Eden. David, the king who raises our hopes the most, commits adultery, fueled by lust, and then commits murder and lies to try and cover it up. The entire nation eventually ends up in exile in Babylon, experiencing Babel literally and spiritually. Like, Jesus walking on earth is beset by violence and opposition. And even his disciples, they jostle for power and ultimately scatter and flee from him at his darkest hour. And then Jesus is hung on a cross. And we hold our breath as appearances scream that the way of suffering sacrifice cannot be the way that this plan is going to succeed. And then even in our own lives, this question, it continues to bubble down to us. As Jesus renews us, we become increasingly aware just how much work there is to do. Like, we think we're a little bit broken and we turn to Jesus and we're like, oh no, it's not a little, it's a lot. And it's so easy to become daunted by the formation ahead of us, haunted by the failures behind us. And then we lift up our eyes to the world and the people around us and wonder what hope there can be for their restoration in the midst of so much evil and brokenness. So what we're going to do is zoom in on Joseph, because God knows this is a big question. And he wants to tackle it. He wants us to know why there is hope for restoration in the midst of a desperately broken world. And so let's zoom in. Because something plays out here that can really change the story that we live in, the narrative we live under. So Joseph's story begins as the favorite of his father. That's what we read at the start. He's the favorite, but he is misunderstood and ostracized in his family. His mother, Rachel, has died, and the way his father treats him is causing his brothers to hate him. So we see this in Genesis 37, verse 4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they couldn't even speak a kind word to him. This is not hidden away hatred. This is like bubbling over, fermenting, the kombucha jar's going to explode hatred. And God, though, he is speaking to Joseph through dreams. But the way that he shares these things with his family causes him to be seen, even by his father, as a threat. And his family calls him the dreamer. And this is the identity spoken over Joseph, that he is someone who is detached from reality, not useful, not a contributor, not going to be used. A little bit later on, when the brothers end up alone with Joseph, out where the sheep are, away from the protection of his father, a plot emerges to murder him. The hatred, the jealousy, the desire for vindication are spilling over. It says in verse 20, "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." But Judah, one of his brothers, with this tiny, like you need a microscope to see it, spark of compassion, offers a different idea, like a plan B. "Come," in verse 27, "let's sell him to the Ishmaelites as a slave and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." Like, way to go, Judah. Way to honor the fact that he's your flesh and blood. This is quite some plan B. Sell him as a slave. And so Joseph is sold into slavery, and he ends up in the house of an Egyptian official called Potiphar. And this is where something really interesting starts showing up. Others can see that God is with Joseph, even the Egyptians. It says a couple of chapters later in 39, in verse 3 and 4, when his master Potiphar saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes, and Potiphar put him in charge of his household. And so Joseph gets elevated. He's shown great trust, and he's blessed, and he's being a blessing. This is a very Genesis 12 pattern, but there's trouble. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. And when he refuses and flees, she lies about what's happened. So many lies throughout this story. That's another one. And Joseph ends up in prison. But even there, this same interesting dynamic plays out, even in prison. It says in verse 20, while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. And he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And in prison, Joseph interprets dreams for Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, who are two of his fellow prisoners. And the cupbearer, God reveals that he's going to be restored to Pharaoh's side. And Joseph says something really interesting to the cupbearer in chapter 40, verse 14. He says, when all goes well with you, remember me. Feeling forgotten. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. And even here, I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. As Joseph speaks about himself, his own lived experience, it's clear that he is feeling unseen, abandoned, isolated. He's feeling displaced from the life he feels he ought to be living. Isn't that so easy for us to associate with that feeling in a world beset by comparison and trouble? And so, mixed with hardship and injustice, it's hard for Joseph to experience that God is with him, to feel a part of the work of God's promise unfolding. Well, eventually, Pharaoh has his own troubling dreams. The cupbearer remembers Joseph. And so Joseph is brought in and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, pointing to God as the one who reveals. And again, this dynamic emerges. Joseph is elevated to incredible power and privilege and influence in Egypt, and he becomes even more blessed to be a blessing, preparing Egypt to survive 7 years of famine. It says this in chapter 41, verse 39. Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God, again seeing God's hand on Joseph, has made all this known to you, there's no one as discerning and wise as you. Because Joseph was a really awesome steward of the things that were entrusted to him. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. So the powerless has become the most powerful. This amazing turnaround. And the famine, it's not just affecting Egypt, it's affecting the whole ancient Near East. And so Jacob's family, back in Canaan, they are struggling to have enough food to eat as well. And they come to Egypt to buy grain. And the brothers end up bowing down to this Egyptian official, not recognizing that it's actually Joseph, their brother. And this is a fulfillment of those dreams from years ago. But instead of bowing down because they're being forced to by an abuse of power, which is what they anticipated the threat being, they're actually bowing down to receive a blessing. It's going really differently. And then Joseph puts them through a series of tests because he's trying to figure out, have they changed? Have his brothers changed? Can he trust them? And the tipping point comes when the youngest brother, Benjamin, the new favorite of his father, is in danger. And Judah, remember him, the one with the terrible plan B? He steps forward and offers to become a slave in Benjamin's place to spare their father's grief. This is a totally transformed Judah, a totally different Judah to the one we meet at the beginning of the story. And in fact, chapter 38, if you've been reading through with us, it's sort of this story of Judah and Tamar, and you're thinking, what is that doing in the middle of this story? It's there to show us how, unbeknownst to Joseph, in the midst of deep brokenness, God is forming Judah. God is at work. And Joseph sees this transformation, and then he's able to reveal himself to his brothers. And there's this beautiful reconciliation. Joseph's able to say in chapter 45, verse 5, don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. And later, after Jacob dies, when his brothers are starting to sweat a little bit, wondering if they might still now be in trouble, he reiterates this to the brothers in chapter 50, saying, You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph has undergone his own transformation. He no longer sees himself as apart from the promise of God, separated from it. Instead, he sees God. He sees God at work in it and around it. He's able to recognize it, and it changes everything. Him being able to recognize God with him enables him to see himself as a participant in the unfolding promise of God's work. And the way that God is using him to be a blessing, to redeem evil and to bless others. And that recognition is what enables Joseph to reconcile with his family. This is the emphatic answer to our question. Even in the bleakest situations, God is faithfully continuing to work to bring about his plan of redemption, of restoration. And the twist is that God is not working in spite of broken humans, but God is working through them, by forming them. Broken people are not obstacles to God's faithfulness to his plan. They are part of it. God is being faithful, not just to his plan, not just to his destination to get back to Eden. He's faithful to us, broken humans. We're a part of it. And God's not dealing with people begrudgingly. I guess I'll have to form you because you're in the way. You're a problem. I think sometimes when we think of God's faithfulness, we're just like, yeah, he's just really stubborn. He wants to get back to Eden. And he must be so frustrated that we're in the way. No, he's stepping in and rescuing and restoring people because he really likes doing it, because he cares about them. And the enemy tries to twist this, trying to keep us feeling like God doesn't feel that way towards us, trying to keep the shame central so that we end up hiding from the one that actually wants to love and rescue us. This faithfulness of God to always work, even when it seems impossible, that faithfulness is what makes it safe so that we can stop hiding and actually respond to God's call. And this display of faithfulness throughout this story, it's amazing. But alongside it, there's also a faithful method. There's this repeated pattern, and it helps us know in our own stories what to expect from how the Father will treat us. So I want us to notice in Joseph's life this pattern unfolding. And step one is God seeing. Joseph is unseen by his family, and in the middle of the story, he feels maybe unseen even by God. But by the end, he's able to recognize that God has had a hand in his story all along. God has not been distant. He's been watching. He's been working. If he looked just at appearances, he wouldn't have seen God. But God was there. And then step two is that God makes safe. There are so many steps where Joseph was in grave danger, but he is preserved. He's rescued, not from suffering, but through suffering. God is faithful to stick with him, to bring him through it to a place of safety. And as God is doing these things, showing that he's with him, showing that he's caring, that he's protecting, Joseph experiences a transformation of identity. He moves from being the dreamer, the one who is apparently separated from what God's doing and what God's building and from his family, to being the most important conduit in the whole ancient world of God's blessing. And right at the epicenter of a reunited, reconciled family. Like the complete opposite identity. And as God is doing this in Joseph, it actually sets Joseph free. It creates freedom. Receiving the reality of God's presence and God's involvement, it frees Joseph from living as a frustrated victim, maybe bitter, angry at his brothers, frustrated at his circumstances. He's freed by God's work to live as the different person that God is actually calling him to be and saying that he is. And then as that happens, Joseph finds himself in partnership with God's purposes. He experiences that send of God's promise, that commissioning into partnership. Joseph becomes a part of God's wider redemptive mission. He's a partner with God's purposes, blessed to be a blessing. And not just to his family, and not even just to Egypt, but to the whole known world. And we don't have time this morning, but this is a really important biblical pattern. If you go back and read carefully, you'll see the same things in the same order play out in the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Hagar. You move forward in the Torah, you're going to see it play out in Moses, in Gideon, in King David, and many more. Now, there are times when God does withstand our brokenness. He doesn't make it easy for us to walk the path of the serpent. He wants us to actually experience resistance, if that's what we're doing. But as that resistance gets our attention and we turn to God, this is what we find waiting for us consistently throughout the scriptures. This is like the look in God's eyes, the actions in his heart, that he's ready to move into reality as we turn to him. We see this pattern unfold really clearly in the Gospels with Jesus. And so what I want to do today as we finish up is to take a look at a couple of times in the Gospels where Jesus does this. And my prayer for us today as we look in the Gospels is we would see ourselves reflected in these poignant encounters with Jesus and allow God, as he shows us his heart, as he shows us what he does, to actually shape our own expectations of what God wants to do with us. And so the first thing we're going to look at is in Luke chapter 7. So it's time for 30 seconds of quiet shuffling noises. So turn to Luke chapter 7 and verse 36. We're going to read about one of these many occasions when Jesus gets invited for dinner. Which, by the way, the amount of times interesting things happen around a dinner table, you got to wonder whether, church is supposed to be like this or around a table, which gets me really excited for getting ourselves ready to have a table gathering coming soon. So another interesting dinner time encounter with Jesus. So let's begin reading in verse 36. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life, probably a prostitute, learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisees who'd invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. So everyone in this room is looking at this woman with judgment. She ought not to be there. She ought to be unseen. She ought to be rejected. She ought to be ashamed. But Jesus looks at her and sees her differently, recognizing her love for one who helps sinners like her and her courage in allowing that love to shape what she does, Jesus addresses the room and changes the whole room from being a threat to her to being a safe place. So Jesus answered in verse 40 and said, Simon, I've got something to tell you. Bet Simon's ears pricked up. He was like, awesome. Like, this rabbi's got something to say, like, special to me. He's going to feel different in a second. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? And Simon replied, suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven? You've judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned towards the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Here's this person feeling ashamed, rejected, moved to the sideline. And Jesus elevates her and defends her and transforms her identity from the sinful woman to the forgiven, loving, honoring woman. And Jesus doesn't only change the identity spoken over her, but the reality of her relationship to the sin that's in her story, setting her free by forgiving her. Jesus said to her in verse 48, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who's this that forgives sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And Jesus finishes by sending her into a new, freed future, redeemed into a new relationship with herself, with God, and with others. It's this pattern. Okay, let's look at it again. Turn back a few pages. Let's see it somewhere else. Turn to Mark chapter 5. And we're going to start reading. We're not going to start versing. That's like slam poetry. We're not doing that today. We're going to start reading in verse 24. Mark chapter 5, verse 24. This is a moment where Jesus is responding to an emergency request for a healing. And so he's heading across town, but heading across town through this bustling, thronging crowd that want to encounter Jesus. So beginning in verse 24, a large crowd pressed around him as they followed him. And a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she got worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. And immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? The disciples think this is a hilarious question. You see the people crowding against you. How can you ask who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. You see, this woman who had been sick for 12 years, because she was bleeding, had also been unclean, separated from the religious life of her community, and probably viewed as cursed. She had lived a life of shame, alone. And so she interacted with Jesus in incognito mode because she didn't want to be seen. Because for her, to be seen was to be judged. And Jesus breaks through this because he needs her to experience being seen differently. It's not okay that she thinks this is all she can expect. In verse 33, the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. So here she is, afraid, feeling unsafe, so used to being the problem. She anticipates rejection, but she's going to get a surprise. Verse 34, Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." No longer identified as the unclean outcast, her new identity is daughter. She's not unsafe. She's family, received, owned, claimed by Jesus as family. And the condition that's kept her trapped is healed, and she's being set free. And then we get the last step again. Go in peace and be free from your suffering. Jesus sends her into a restored life, not just sickness-free, but also now restored to her community. And we don't have time to unpack them all, but if you want to spend the afternoon reading through all the Gospels, because there's not much else on today, you will see the same pattern play out in Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus' dinner with Levi and his dinner with Zacchaeus, when he heals blind Bartimaeus, and actually most of his healings, same pattern. With Peter, when Peter denies him, same pattern. And actually into the early church, as the Spirit leads the disciples out into the world, they start to do the same thing. It's ubiquitous. Throughout the whole of Scripture, there is a pattern of how God redeems. And it's the answer to this big question of whether we should have hope. We need to tune in to this pattern. This is what God does when he engages us. He wants to look at us in the eye, face to face, so we can experience his heart for us. So if this is the pattern, let's get practical. How do we respond? The most important thing is that you receive God's healing look of love for yourself. Maybe you need a fresh encounter with God. Don't hide, but turn to Jesus. Allow yourself to be seen. Don't hide from his face because you don't need to. Turn to him and let him interact with you. We need that look of love, and not just like periodically in our lives. We need to live under the experience of God's love, because that's what makes us free and safe and have the right identity and all of those things on that list. And if you're not living with the experience of God's loving look, in that safety of his faithfulness, what will happen is you will turn to other loves to try to create that peace and safety. But only God can satisfy. And maybe that's you today. Maybe you find yourself caught in disordered desires while the pattern offers you a path. And it's not the one that the enemy tries to whisper to us, which is fix your heart so you can turn to God. No, the healing begins in your soul by allowing the Father to look you in the eye and say, I love you. That's where the freedom begins. That's where the route to healing begins. And then lastly, this is God's faithfulness. And faithfulness in the midst of all of these circumstances that would make you think, I don't know if it's going to work. God really wants to shine his faithfulness in the foreground and say, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. And it calls out to us And it invites us into this intentional posture. We need to resist this world screaming over us fear and insecurity, trying to crush our hope. And we need to receive this invitation of a faithful God to love us and see us and lead us. And as we do that, and as God sends us, God will use us to then show others how Jesus sees them. And that's the mission. So would you stand with me? I want to pray.
Thanks for listening. For more resources and to partner with us through giving, visit us at ajesuschurch.org.